So it seems like your fellowship was fairly unconstrained. Didn't tell you what you can and cannot publish, what area of research you could focus on, and what data should be withheld. So what are tolerable constraints and what aren't?
Go in with open eyes and be like, well, if I'm taking this money from a company, does that company benefit? And if so, does that affect how I'm going to frame this? And I think a lot of people in academia don't see government funding as having any strings attached. But in shaping the questions that people are asking, it becomes a little bit squishier than industry funding is bad and government funding is good.
How to Science, a podcast from the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, Season 2. With podcast host, LSA Professor Monica Duz. This is me. The theme of the season is How to Science in Society. Season 2 explores the lives of scientists. We're interested in figuring out who are scientists, but also what it's like to do science in the context of a bigger society. After this story, I'll be back with a Q&A with the guest to talk more about how to science in society. Take a look through someone else's safety goggles.
My name is Kevin Boehnke. I'm a postdoc in anesthesiology here at University of Michigan. I did my bachelor's in biology in LS&A and then completed my PhD in public health, environmental health sciences in 2017.
So your PhD was in public health, studying water quality, but now you're
in anesthesiology.
And you're studying cannabis there.
You got it. I worked for a while at NSF International, which is a public health and safety company in town.
Oh, cool.
And then from that started my PhD in public health, which is where this story begins. So I was in the fourth year of my PhD. I was studying public health and global water quality and really trying to figure out what I was going to do to make the work that I was doing sustainable. So, of course, part of being a PhD student is applying for funding, and I found this fellowship called the Dow Sustainability Fellowship through the Graham Institute of Sustainability. And so I applied for it and was really proud when I won it. I also do want to say that what happened is Dow Chemical Company gave a gift to the Graham Institute of Sustainability. So it's not like the money came from Dow and then it went to me. It went through this intermediate who then dispensed funds to fellows throughout the university. And it was an internal competition, so it's still a relatively difficult fellowship to obtain. And so a few months into the fellowship, I got this email from a U of M faculty member about how Dow was misrepresenting one of its new pesticides to the Environmental Protection Agency. And so I will quote, "I thought it might interest some of you to know what your benefactor is doing for the environment. I am hopeful that it might generate discussion." And so this kind of hit me like a lightning bolt. I was pretty shocked about this and thinking like, oh yeah, we did take this money from Dow. What does this mean? And so I was reflecting on this and thinking, if I'm doing this work from a public health standpoint, am I selling out when I take this money from Dow? I disagree with them on a good number of things of what they've done in the past. And so what does this mean about my moral compass? Simply trying to really consider what the implications are of taking money to do public health work from a company who in many ways has done some damage to public health. What does that conflict mean? And is it worth it to receive that money, even if there are no strings attached, because there's this explicit no strings attached, there's no influence of Dow on study design or anything like that. The situation is simply, I'm going to acknowledge Dow for funding my work, but they didn't have anything else to do with it. To really be as honest as possible about what my work might mean, I feel like I have to really consider these bigger picture implications. Even though there are no strings attached, they didn't have any control over study design or anything about this. I feel like it really was a formative moment that took my science out of academia and placed it right squarely in society. As part of this reflection, I talked to some of the other Dow fellows who, of course, received the same email. Nobody was willing to talk about it in like a public space, but we kind of huddled in small groups to discuss it. When we got the email, there's kind of this odd silence around what was happening. So everybody acknowledged it, but we really never came together and discussed it. So I still don't know what people are thinking about. It would be nice to, have a sense of how people were responding to that situation. I don't think people were broadcasting their feelings that intensely. Like, one of the people who I talked to most about it, he had a very, very similar viewpoint to what I did. I mean, he was a student in this faculty member's lab, and he was like, I know that Dow has this past that I know my advisor doesn't agree with and that I don't agree with. But I need to do the science that I think is important, and so I'm willing to compromise to make that happen. I came to the realization that regardless of whether I was funded by the government, through industry, through a foundation, through private wealth, which I don't have, but regardless of that funding source, I would need to be constrained in some ways by the views of that agency and how I was going to talk about my science and what it was going to mean. It did give me a sense of the real truth that these institutions are not fully monolithic. They have good people doing good work, even if they also have, people doing work that I really don't agree with or might find deplorable. So that was really helpful for my development. This was also then useful as I transitioned out of my PhD and into a new and controversial field, which was centered around medical cannabis. So I finished my PhD and I started my postdoc studying cannabis as an opioid substitute in the pain management context. This field is booming. The industry is huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's going to keep growing both in the US and globally. Moving forward and thinking about how I'm going to ask the questions that I want, I'm trying to figure out how to balance the questions that I want to ask and the perception of my work based on where I get that funding, especially given that I am junior in the field and I have a reputation to consider. Since part of what I want to do is have a positive impact, I want to be really careful about those things. As I move forward, if I get to the point that I can't ask the questions that I want with government funding or within the constraints of academia, I think I'm still open to working with and having financial ties to cannabis companies. What I'd like to continue to do is think about how I can best work within the constraints of the system to ask and answer the types of questions that I think are important and impactful.
If this email came now to a bunch of graduate students, what would you tell them?
I think the advice I would give is step out of the lab. Think about what your science means. Why are you doing it in the first place? And who might it impact in society? Who might it benefit? Who might it not benefit? And where do you want to go with it? What are the implications that will affect you as a scientist, as an individual, and then society as a whole, as well as the planet as a whole? I think it takes a lot of work and a lot of interest and thought to really think through a good number of the implications, but I think that actually makes the science more impactful in the long run when people are really considering those things when they're coming up with a study design, when they're writing a discussion section and saying, this is what my data mean.
That's kind of cool what you said, because the topic of the season is how to science in society. And that's exactly what you said, right? Think about your implication of your research, not as just inside the lab, step outside the lab into society and think about what you do in the little can really impact the big. So is it fair to say that your email to awardees of this fellowship might be quite different than the one you received? And is it possible that that email perhaps didn't really achieve its goal, right? Because when you read it, it said, let's have a conversation. But in fact, the conversation wasn't a broad conversation among all the fellows. And so in many ways, I wonder if that perhaps missed the goal, right?
I guess it depends on how well you know your audience and what the goal is. If the goal is to have a discussion with the people who are affected by it, I think sometimes being less provocative can allow you to facilitate those kinds of discussions more easily. At the same time, such a discussion might not have the same kind of like knock you out of your seat. And so I think it's a question of what the intent is, and also if I did it, would I want to go in and facilitate a discussion, or am I hoping that somebody will run with this idea and think about it a lot and change because of it?
So it seems like your fellowship was fairly unconstrained. The only thing that was constrained is that the money comes from Dow, but they didn't tell you what you can and cannot publish. They didn't tell you what area of research you could focus on, and they didn't tell you what data should be withheld. So what are tolerable constraints and what aren't?
I think that is a really good question. It speaks a lot to the context of what an individual scientist would want to do and who their audience is, because, you know, as scientists, we do absolutely have audiences, and sometimes it's just the people in our field. Sometimes it's a certain segment of the population or a voting bloc or whatever it might be. I think one of the differences is how funding from industry is viewed in academia versus how government funding is viewed. And I think a lot of people in academia don't see government funding as having any strings attached. I think that maybe it has fewer, but in shaping the questions that people are asking in all of the paperwork that goes with getting government funding, it becomes a little bit squishier than industry funding is bad and government funding is good. I think they can both be good and they can both be bad. It's just a question of degree. And again, it really depends on the individual preferences of the scientist on what is most important to them, what kinds of questions they really need or want to ask. And if they can ask those questions with one source but not the other, and they can do it with as few constraints as possible, they should do it. But they should also go in with open eyes and be like, well, if I'm taking this money from a company, does that company benefit? And if so, does that affect how I'm going to frame this?
So I agree. Like, it's really interesting to think about how much stigma we pose on private funding, because that's the obvious thing, but maybe we don't think quite as deeply about all the other sources of constraint and bias that are just introduced in the normal scientific process in society.
But I agree with you. There's systemic issues, and that's partly why science is so iterative, is hopefully eventually through enough replication and good work, the truth will emerge. But then the truth is maybe different than what we thought it might be. And that's something that I really find so exciting about the scientific process and as a lens to view the world.
You already talked about how now that you're doing research on cannabis, how what you do has been informed by the moral lens you found through this experience. So what sort of things do you think directly apply?
I think one of the big issues in the cannabis space right now is it's extremely polarized. We have people who are advocating for cannabis saying this is a panacea, it's going to solve health problems from cancer to Alzheimer's, the gamut. And then you have people on the other side who say cannabis is a poison, it's addictive, and it has no potential therapeutic benefit. Part of how I'm trying to approach this question is to really take a data-driven path as much as possible. And so I think it's clear at this point that neither of those extremes is valid. And so that nuanced lens of putting science squarely in society is something that I am doing my best to embody as I move forward in this space, and to take with a grain of salt the claims made by different sides. So something that I look for a lot then in the literature is consistency. If consistent trends emerge, then to me that's a good sign that what we're looking at might be true. But of course, that's difficult when we're in the midst of this opioid crisis. A lot of people have fixated on cannabis, but it is not going to solve the whole crisis. That's a much bigger societal question. It gets to be this really nuanced and interesting question, and trying to figure out how best to help the people who can be helped with this method, and then get other people the support that they need who would not be helped by cannabis. And, going back into the public health space, we dramatically underfund a lot of the things that would help with abuse, addiction, a lot of the things that lead there in the first place, like unemployment, the debt cycle, all of these things that really leave people feeling helpless.
Now, do you check when you're done reading a paper the acknowledgements to see who funds the study?
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to do. I think, if it's methodologically sound and people acknowledge the limitations of the data, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter who funds it. I think if people are being good scientists, they just put that all out on the table, and then they see how it stands. The science should be able to speak for itself, but science is a human endeavor. It's way squishier than that.
What about joining our Facebook How to Science podcast group, where you can learn more about science, about how to science, and maybe get to talk to scientists about science news? Join the How to Science Facebook community, where we want to pop the bubble of the lab and see what it's like to do science in society. Make sure you subscribe. It's a hard word, subscribe. Okay. Subscribe to the podcast. Help your friends find out how to science by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. And I honestly can barely pronounce the word algorithm, but something about the iTunes algorithm really helps other people that might never otherwise hear about it find it and listen to it. How to science. How to science. How to science.
The How to Science podcast is recorded at WCBN FM, the student-run, community-supported radio station on the campus of the University of Michigan.
Here's how I science.
Squishy? I like that term.